soon. Miss Peggy gave me a card she wanted us to read this morning, so we'll go ahead and do that at this time while you turn in your Old Testaments to the book of Lamentations. Miss Peggy says, "It's with sadness that I write this card. Thanks to each one who has helped furnish the food and drinks that were brought to my house this Saturday. That would be the Saturday after Monroe died, and the ladies that were at my house at 8:30 to get things going, and to see the food that was on the table all day long. Special thanks to Keith for taking care of the drinks." Peggy says, "I love each and every one of you, and that she's here for us." God bless and love Peggy, also Phyllis and Jeff and Jared and Lauren. We continue to wrap our arms of love around Miss Peggy and her family, and Miss Joy and her family. It's been a tough couple of weeks, and we continue to pray for them even this morning. So Lord willing, the year 2023 will have Lonnie Jones with us, preacher from Huntsville area, and he is a frequent rock climber, and he said that began in high school. He and some of his high school buddies learned to climb up a tree and then rappel down trees, and they could do it with kind of rock hills and dirt mounds. And one day they caught wind from the store in town that they were selling true, like heavy-duty, properly rated climbing rope. So they went and bought actual climbing rope instead of having to use knockoff stuff that was weaker. And he said two of his buddies decided to buy bright orange climbing rope, 200 feet, 150 feet worth of that rope. And that's what they would carry around town as they were climbing various trees and rappelling down them. Well, one day after school, they were headed out. They were going to climb, and they noticed a classmate of theirs walking the other side of the road carrying a bright orange extension cord, long electrical cord. They just kind of nod and go on about their business. And Lonnie and friends just assume, he's doing some yard work and he needs power tools, or he's, maybe doing some carpentry and needs that extra long extension cord, and they just don't think anything about it. So the next day at school, that classmate walks in late, and he's limping a little bit, he's bruised, he's cut up, and he walks straight over to Lonnie and says, "Jones, what kind of rope are y'all using to climb trees with?" And it dawned on Lonnie exactly what he was doing with that orange extension cord. He was using it to climb trees and rappel down, and it gave way. It failed, then he fell and was hurt. Lonnie makes this point. When we look and observe what someone else is doing, and then we just kind of assume whatever it is, and we exchange what the reality is kind of for whatever we think it is, we shouldn't be surprised when we fall, when we have consequences, when we're left in pain. As we wind down this study of our current culture, what we've made the observation of is that it's secularized, it's self-driven, it's certainly depraved in terms of its sexuality. But we must not miss that it is still struggling. It's hurt. It's exchanged the realities that it observed from a structure of God. And we need to be clear that that culture, it's made that exchange, and it's bold and it's brazen at times, but yet it's a culture that in many ways is struggling in ways that it's never struggled before. We ask the questions: how has our technological advances, how have they helped us to overcome and have true happiness and fulfillment? Are we there? We're as advanced as we've ever been technologically, medically. Well, where's the happiness and fulfillment? We're able to connect to each other more than ever and in ways we never thought possible. Has that solved our loneliness problems? How has all of this supposed academic, cultural, quote, progress, how has that increased overall satisfaction of life? Even among those who would say we are responsible for that progress. Has it followed? Does it follow? No, it does not. And we need to make two disclaimers before we move on this morning. We're in a culture that in a lot of metrics is as lonely and depressed and struggling as it ever has been. But two disclaimers. Number one, this is true pre-pandemic. We could rewind 24 months, 36 months, and this would essentially all be the same. Now, in many ways, the pandemic has sped some things up. It's maybe magnified some things. But we were on this path long before we ever knew what COVID-19 was. Second disclaimer, as we talk about some of these things that are mental health kind of issues, what we're not doing this morning is addressing any individual acute cases, okay? So this is not a lesson on mental health. It's a lesson on look at the results of rejecting God. Are we surprised that we now see this so prevalent in culture? So if you're going through a difficult season, if you're kind of dealing with some acute instances of depression or anxiety, those kind of things, please know that we're always here for you. And we have multiple professionals we can help you with. And that's something God helps us through, always. So we're not addressing that aspect of it. And especially as we walk through the first half of this lesson, don't think that we're pointing fingers and saying this is why every case, every instance of those kind of things happens. That's not what we're saying. We're trying to make a cultural observation, all right? So a culture that rejects God should not be surprised at its feelings of inadequacy and emptiness. That's the overall observation we're making this morning. As we turn our attention to Lamentations, we ask this question: what happens to a people who continue acting on what is right in their own eyes, but do so for centuries? That's the phrase from the book of Judges that we looked at last week with that horrifying story. Well, now we're some 800, 900, maybe 1,000 years removed since those events of Judges. So what's going to be the result, the consequences from these people, God's people, the Jews, after they continue to fall back into that trap of seeking what's right in their own eyes? Lamentations chronicles a lot of that. After they're taken into captivity by Babylon, you see this beautiful poetic expression of grief and suffering, most likely written by Jeremiah the prophet. So listen to some of the things he highlights. Very first chapter, Lamentations chapter 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. Verse 2. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Now notice the exchange, the flip that's happened. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. So they've rejected God for the arms of the other nations. They've rejected the true God for the service of these idols they've brought in as well. And so now the observation is, picture the city and picture the people as this widow. They've abandoned God, and now they're left all alone. And although they ran to the arms of these other peoples and these other gods, now she has no one to comfort her. Now they have turned against her and are her enemies. You see the exchange that's happened? You had the structure of God. You had the truth of God. But you've rejected him long enough that he has turned you over to your own choices and consequences. And those that you went to instead of going to God don't have the capacity to comfort you. That's a key phrase in Lamentations chapter 1. They have no one to comfort them. Chapter 1 and verse 9. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Circle that phrase. She took no thought of her future. Therefore her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. Why in the world did she take no thought for a future? These Israelites, these Jews, is it because God didn't warn them? Is it because God didn't send men like Moses and Aaron and Joshua and the prophets to warn them? No, they did. They warned them over and over and time again. But the people never thought seriously about the warnings. And they never thought about their future. They never put two and two together and said, if I continue on this path, that God will then cause these consequences. He will allow me to experience the consequences of his warnings. Chapter 1, verse 16. For these things I weep. My eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me. Do you hear it? I'm weeping. I can't stop. Why? Because a comforter is far from me. one to revive my spirit. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands. He's reaching out for help. But there is none to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob that his neighbors should be his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. You hear the repeated refrain. There's no one to comfort. They sought protection. They sought attention from all these outside forces that, by the way, they should have eradicated first when they entered. But now that they didn't, they keep running to them. And the observation is they're of no value. They can't help you. They can't comfort you. They cannot rescue you. The consequences God is allowing you to experience. If you fast forward to chapter 5 of Lamentations, what you find is this progression toward repentance, okay? So there's the realization they have no one to comfort. But in chapter 5, there's this orientation toward repentance. Here's one of the observations that they have. So Lamentations chapter 5. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. You hear their realization. This is impacted to the level of the home, the family. You see that overlap with our current culture, right? It's become so pervasive. Where does it impact us? It impacts us directly in the home. They're having that realization. But also look at verse 4. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. Hear the realization? We've been provided by God so abundantly, but now we have to do it for ourselves. Now we depend on someone else. Now we must pay our own price. When we realize what God has left us up to now, we realize how inadequate we are to truly fend for ourselves. So now we need to ask this question: how did they get here? What happened in the centuries that transpired between Judges and now Lamentations in this time of Babylonian exile? Isaiah 5 gives us some insight to that. The end of chapter 5 of Isaiah was, quote, a contemporary of Jeremiah from a thematic standpoint, meaning they both prophesied about the same things, the Babylonian captivity, but Isaiah lived prior to Jeremiah, okay? So the end of chapter 5 is where you see directly the prophecy about Babylonian coming in and taking Israel captive. So what we want to do is just see that overlap, that connection, and then go in earlier into chapter 5 to see here's what God has against them. And here's the summary. He tells a parable about a vineyard, and he gives the choicest, best conditions to that vineyard. The best ground, a location for him to dwell among them. Everything is the best. And yet when it comes time to harvest those grapes, they're wild grapes. They look just like the rest of the people. And you see how that parallels with the Jews. Because here they've been given this land, and they've been given God, they've been given his law, his presence among them, a place for him to dwell as the temple, the tabernacle, then eventually the temple. And yet now, by the time they're taken captive, their lives, their actions, their worship looks just like that of all the peoples around them. So listen to Isaiah 5 and verse 4. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? When I looked for big, succulent grapes that I could juice, that I could make great product with that would stand out above the rest, why did I keep finding grapes that look just like untilled, unkept, unfertilized grapes? So verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. The men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And they are the people he plants, he says. He looked for justice. That's the kind of grape he looked for. He looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold, outcry. I'm telling you what I looked for, but I'm not receiving anything based on the advantages I gave you. And don't miss this connection. He says, I looked for justice. I looked for a people who would love their neighbor as themselves. But instead I found people who were given over to bloodshed. I looked for righteousness. I looked for people who loved the Lord their God with all of their heart, soul, mind, and strength. But instead, I found outcries that come from wickedness. It always happens. When wickedness prevails, people suffer. So in the time period that happens between Judges and now the captivity, don't miss that they got what they wanted. Remember, Judges ends, there was no king in Israel. They kept clamoring for a king to be like the peoples around them. Well, eventually God allows them to take that king, to have that king. Saul was the first king. They got what they wanted. Did it matter? They still continued to bear wild grapes. Had a couple of good kings. They had some great division after Solomon. Division is harmful. We can't discount the role of division in this whole trajectory. Assyria takes out the northern kingdom, leaves only the 2 tribes in the south there in Judah. They begin to assimilate with all the peoples around them. They worship their gods. They marry their women. They begin to involve themselves in any sorts of impurities because of those false gods and those systems. They seek compromise diplomatically instead of honoring God and His will. And eventually, like what always happens, the innocent begin to suffer. The needy suffer. The vulnerable suffer. Because they become so self-absorbed. They're so enamored with doing what was right in their own eyes. They do not see their neighbor who's suffering and in need. So you see that play out in the verses that follow after verse 7 of Isaiah 5. He paints this picture based on the grapes, and it's almost as if he shows this cluster of wild grapes. You want to see grapes that are the grapes that I reject? Then keep reading, he says, verses 8 through 23. So let's read just one section near the end of that. Look at verse 20 to see the woes he pronounces on them. This is what you've done with what I've given you. Verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. You see the exchange, right? I'm going to take what is not good and begin to somehow redefine it and pretend and just force it to be what's good. Whoa, that's a pronouncement of judgment against them. 21. Woe to those who were wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. What's changed since Judges? What's changed? Nothing. They've spent centuries sowing those same seeds of doing what they think best over and over again. So he now pronounces this woe against them because of it. Verse 22, woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and valiant men and mixing strong drink. You can learn a lot about a civilization by noticing the people they celebrate, the people they honor. And he says your heroes, your celebrities, are drunken celebrities. They're people that are known for sin instead of for righteousness and valor and honor. And then verse 23, it always lands here. Who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of his right. The more sin increases, so too does suffering, especially among the most vulnerable of the people. So as we move to kind of apply this to our own culture, again, when we say culture, we mean kind of the undefined but yet very real collection of shared values. Entertainment, art, academia, news. What values do they operate by? That's what we commonly call culture. That has shifted and changed. It always is changing, but it's shifted more rapidly than ever before over the past few decades. What we notice is that modern day loneliness echoes this loneliness found in the captivity of the Israelites. That when we exchange a structure that is built by God, that is intended by God, that at least honors and recognizes God, we exchange that for what we think will work. We should not be surprised when we're left feeling inadequate and empty and lonely. Now, how do we describe this loneliness? Let's first kind of look at it from a specific anecdote, a little bit of a data study as well, but Dallas news station, ABC news station in Dallas in May of 2019 ran a report. So this is pre-pandemic. Ran a report and found that Parkland Hospital, one of the big hospitals there in town, had just noticed this increased wave of repeat visitors to the ER. And so they worked with other local hospitals, I think 5 in total, so Parkland Hospital plus 4 more. They figured out there were 80 people in Dallas who between those 5 hospitals over a 12-month period visited 5,139 times. So 5,100 ER visits by 80 different people over the course of a year. And so they said, well, this is a problem. This has all sorts of implications. They estimated the value at about $14 million of treatment and time. So they interviewed and they studied these 80 people. And they tried to find as many correlating factors as they could. Why are these people the ones who keep coming back? And some of the things that we would suspect would unite them weren't really strong correlations. Poverty wasn't a strong correlation. Looking for food wasn't a strong correlation. Substance abuse wasn't really a strong correlation to what we might expect. But across the board, loneliness and the need for companionship was identified as the primary factor why they kept coming back to the ER. And one of the researchers said, just imagine, the more often you go, the more often they learn you by name, and they call you by name, and they ask you how you're doing, and they ask you how your day's been. And you begin to think, well, this is the best place I can go for some companionship. So they worked with local clinics, they worked with churches, they worked with some social workers, and they figured out a way to try to get these people involved in different ways relationally. And at last report, they've dropped those ER visits by 70% among those 80 people. So just think about how many different fingers that one story kind of has. We're struggling as a culture, collectively, even though we should be connected as much as ever before. We should have this advancing technology to help us solve problems, and yet we have these loneliness epidemics, difficulties that are ravaging us worse than ever before. Gallup poll. Gallup is non-religious, it's non-partisan, it's based out of D.C. It just kind of runs analytics firms, analytics studies from time to time. Every year, every November, they run a survey where they talk about the state of mental health in America. Just every year, annual. 1980 was the first year they did it. And every time, it's always in the 80s when it comes to how people respond and say, my mental health I would rate as excellent or good. It's always in the 80 percentile. 81 if it's a kind of a down year, 89 if it's a good year. Well, predictably, 2020 was the first year that it dropped below 80%. Fell to 76%. And when people rate their own mental health, they say, not as good this year. More fascinating is what happens when you look at every subcategory by which they broke it down. They broke it down to 19 categories: gender, race, income, even political party. 19 subcategories. Would you believe that 18 of the 19 subcategories all had a drop in how they identified their mental health from the past year? Almost across the board, they said, I'm struggling. This is a harder year. This has been tough. So Gallup said we've got a loneliness epidemic coming right alongside this virus epidemic. Harvard, in conjunction with another group, did another study, and it's the School of Education with Harvard. So you can kind of see how they would have some, maybe some biases in terms of how to control education and all that. Just aside from the numbers they found, listen to their conclusion. Just how they worded their conclusion stood out to me. They said, devastating as this pandemic has been, it has also exposed wide holes in our social fabric and made many Americans keenly aware of how much their daily well-being hinges on the ongoing warmth and care of others. See what they admit? They say this pandemic's been bad, but there were already holes in our social fabric before it began. All this pandemic has done is reminded us and shown us some things we were ignoring, that we need each other, that we need people, and yet we don't have the relationships and the well-being that comes from those relationships that we need. So, as we've said every week, our goal is not to demean culture, certainly on this one. We should be able to empathize with a culture who's suffering some of the consequences of rejecting God. But we must be prepared. Paul would write to us, don't let anybody take you captive. Don't let anybody write you off because you don't meet their definition of what they think you should be. We need to be sure that we're prepared to live in a culture that's struggling and that's lonely. How can we do that? One important thing is don't let a discouraged world tell us to be discouraged right alongside them. If we find ourselves feeling down and upset and struggling and lonely, we need to ask clearly and humbly, is it because someone else told me to be? Or is it because of something true and honest that I need to work through and process with the Lord's help? We've seen these questions before. We talk about them when we have a lesson maybe on our speech. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it helpful? Is it necessary? We need to always be sure our words pass through those filters. But what would happen with our news, with our entertainment, our movies, our TV shows, our music, if we ask those questions all the time? If we set up some barriers of filters entering our minds, unless it's true and right, I'm not letting it in. Unless it's kind and helpful, necessary. Just because a culture that does not recognize God is discouraged doesn't mean that those of us who do know God have to be discouraged too. We can find the truth. We know what kindness is, and we share in His kindness. We have things that help us and build us up. And He gives us what we ought to do, what is indeed necessary. What if we primed our own thoughts by these questions? If we assess our mental thoughts over the past 24 hours, 48 hours, are the things we repeat true? Are they actually true? Are they kind to ourselves? Are they kind to others? Are they helpful? Are they helping us be better? Are they necessary? Obviously, this is the strategy Paul lays out in Philippians 4. Think on these things, and he has that list of those qualities. It's the same thing also that Jeremiah displayed in the midst of that captivity. Lamentations chapter 3 that we read for our scripture reading this morning. Notice the preceding verse. But I call this to mind, or this I call to mind. He remembers. He thinks on these things that are about to follow. And therefore I have hope. Jeremiah shows that in the midst of a circumstantially hopeless situation, maybe even a situation where all of his other companions are acting hopeless, he still accesses hope. How? By choosing to think true, kind, helpful, necessary thoughts. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in Him. I love including 25 and 26 because Jeremiah recognizes just repeating that doesn't solve my problems immediately. The Lord is good to those who wait for Him. The soul who seeks Him, it's good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Now we ask, what about our thoughts the past 24 or 48 hours? Are they true, are they kind, are they helpful, and necessary? How many of them come from this text? How many times do we say positive, true things about God? God is love. His love never ceases. His mercies are unending. Do we ever repeat that throughout the day? How could that sustain us in a culture that's given over to outrage and loneliness? Great is your faithfulness. Yes, the faithfulness of men is undependable and tragic and pathetic at times. But great is your faithfulness, O God. We repeated that any over the past 24, 48 hours? The Lord is my soul's portion. He's who I choose to fulfill me. Do we say that? Therefore I will hope in Him. See the logic? I have hope because I can always access these thoughts that are truth about God. And my circumstances, even the circumstances of the people around me that may be distraught and lonely, do not dictate how I think and thus how I live. But second reminder, it's similar, I guess, but we need to ensure, not just assume, that we're living, that we're making decisions out of love and not out of fear. Those two are contrasted in at least two different passages of the New Testament. Love versus fear. So if I find myself giving over to fear, the response God would tell me is, you instead decide to love. And maybe most directly, and this is again kind of echoing that second disclaimer we gave, every person who deals with some form of anxiety or depression or kind of a mental illness, they're not necessarily caught up in a sin. Okay, we need to be clear about that. It's not one-to-one. But those of us who are continuing to hide some sin perhaps, or continuing to just run through stop signs and giving over to sin, we should not be surprised if there are accompanying mental, emotional difficulties that follow. And so it's a great time to just ask the question, each of us individually, not looking around the room to judge, but ensure myself. If I find myself struggling with some of these loneliness feelings, do I need to repent of some sin? Do I need to instead act out of love and not rejoice over wrongdoing, but instead rejoice over truth? John would say, 1 John 4, that there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Number 3, though, knowing that Christ is the answer, we need to understand that since this culture is defined by a period of struggling and loneliness, what an opportunity to show them the love of Christ. The very next verse in 1 John 4, it's verse 19, that says, we love because he first loved us. We love others because of how he loved and treated us. So Christ is the answer. Therefore, we have the opportunity to show them his love, giving them this hope, this acceptance that they keep searching for, but keep coming up empty and finding. There's plenty of texts in Colossians that would address this. But just quickly call to mind Colossians 1, verse 21. He's addressing them directly. You who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy, blameless, above reproach. What a message to be able to show to a struggling world, a lonely world. You can be holy, blameless, above reproach through Christ. You no longer have to continue in that angst and that outrage and that hostility. You can find a place of peace and holiness before God through his Son. But also consider the language of chapter 3 and verse 10. It's that new self, he says, that we get to put on, that is being renewed after the image of its creator. Think of the power of the word renewed. It kind of echoes Jeremiah, right? In Lamentations 3, your mercies are new every morning. We are made and remade and remade. We are renewed, not stagnant, not static, but constant renewal in the likeness of Christ. We're not remade in the image of culture that shifts and changes and is fickle and eats itself. We're not remade into the fashion of idols. We're not remade into the image of celebrities. We're not even trying to reach some progressive ideal of utopia where there are no problems. But instead, we get to be made more and more into the likeness of our very Creator. The one who knew us before we were formed in the womb. The one who did form us in the womb. And the one who now promises to recreate us into his image. Now listen to how this plays out. We said earlier there were 18 of 19 categories in that loneliness survey that all reported a decrease in mental health. There was one category that showed a 4% increase. One category. They came up with 3 categories for religious attendance. Okay? Those 3 categories were weekly, somewhat weekly / monthly, then not at all. Weekly worship service attendance in the middle of a pandemic saw a 4% increase in mental health by a nonpartisan, non-religious group doing the survey. Those who were sporadic or somewhat weekly or monthly were negative 12%, and those who were never were negative 13%. Think about that. Doing it halfway is almost the same, by their study at least, as doing it not at all. All that study does is reflect what we know to be true in Scripture. That we're made for each other. We're made for God. And we do benefit when we come together to worship God. And when we make it about him and we're brought together by Christ. And so we consider God and we consider Christ, but we also consider one another to stir one another up to love and good works. So all that Gallup poll did was to prove Hebrews 10 and verse 24. What a blessing to know that there's peace, there's hope, there's companionship in this era and in any era. And we are fully surrendered, walking in the love of Christ each and every day. If you have any need at all this morning, please know this time is for you. Maybe you need to put him on in baptism where he forgives. Maybe you need to come back to him after leaving his side. Please know he longs to forgive you just the same. And heaven rejoices, and we will rejoice with you and walk with you as well. If you have those needs, would you use this time now? Come as we sing.